through the dark and dingy garrets and cellars, the air was steaming for being breathed over and over. It was filled with noxious fumes of opium. We groped our way with a candle in hand, pinching our noses until we found a door or window.
Living conditions were hard in America for the Chinese immigrants. It was much different than described to them. The Chinese were told that America was the land of opportunity. They were told that there were large houses and food for everyone, but more importantly, they were told that gold was plentiful.
Chinese were obviously deceived, and they were told stuff like, if you want to strike it rich, all you need to do is go to California. There's gold everywhere, and almost every aspect of life is perfect. There's land and food for anyone who wants to go.
Promises such as these lured the Chinese away from their homelands. Overcrowded living spaces and civil war in China brought miners and merchants wanting to strike it rich from mountains of gold. Using techniques that had been used for centuries in China, some newcomers were successful. Merchants made money selling common necessities in the ships they sailed and called junks.
I worked hard mining for gold. I was accepted into the community and life was good. I didn't know English very well, but I was learning. Then everything came in blue.
Life wasn't all that was promised. At first, the Chinese were welcomed into California. They had a reputation as some of the hardest workers in the West and were treated like guests. In 1852, the governor of California even praised the Chinese of being one of the most worthy classes of newly adopted citizens. However, attitudes towards the Chinese soon changed. As gold became more scarce, American miners became more hostile to foreigners and got a tax passed by state government on foreign miners. The foreigners had to pay a monthly fee for a license to continue mining. Many of the immigrants left the gold fields because they didn't want to pay, but most of the Chinese stayed. Their hardiness only resulted in worse treatment. Many American miners resorted to other methods to drive away the Chinese.
American miners were angry at the Chinese for stealing their gold. The tax the miners convinced California's government to pass didn't drive away the Chinese like hoped. Therefore, the Americans resorted to acts of terrorization against the Chinese. Chinese got their long braids cut off, shacks and housing were burned, and sometimes they were even beaten.
In the morning, my head felt lighter. I felt the back of my head and I found my hair missing. I knew what had happened. The American miners had cut off my braid. The next day, when my companions and I went back to our housing in the camp, we found it ablaze. Anger filled my heart, and from that day, I would mine no more.
Most Chinese were finally deterred and left the mining operations for different lives in the city.
I traded my old life for a new one. My husband came home and I opened a restaurant with him. Our eatery became popular and was soon filled with hungry customers. Someone finally showed respect for us.
The Chinese opened laundromats and stores along with restaurants. The Chinese once again got some respect and kindness in California.
The Chinese started Chinatown, a section of San Francisco that's much like life back home. There's signs, cuisine, ideas, and people who are like us from China, with some American influence infused. Actually, some of the best known and best liked eateries in San Francisco were restaurants owned by Chinese. Americans had never experienced this food, and it soon spread across America.
The Chinese played major parts in shaping the West. They left behind culture, new inventions, and ideas. Chinese food, art, music, and other things spread across America. Merchants brought goods to America during the gold rush that would change some people's way of life.
Actually, the Chinese supplied the majority of the labor for the Transcontinental Railroad. They worked cheap, but they worked hard. Games were made by bosses to make people work even harder. A gold coin for whoever could lay the most track or carve out the biggest rock. Often a Chinese man was recipient of this prize.
When the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, the White Demon officials gave speeches saying this was the greatest feat in the history of mankind. Only Americans could have accomplished it. A white demon in a top hat tapped a gold spike, then pulled it out. Then a Chinaman held the real spike, a steel one, and another hammered it in.
The Chinese were often treated brutally in the West. They helped shape America by their many acts of work and bringing of culture. It was seen that the Chinese were stealing what Americans had, but in reality, the Americans were once immigrants themselves. Without the Chinese help, the country of America could have turned out very different.